It started with the shape, not the walls, not the roof, not the stove or the timber or the number of windows, not even the strange way it hugged the earth like it didn't want to be seen. No, what made folks laugh was the shape. 8 sides, roundish, almost like something a child would sketch if he didn't know how houses worked. 8 sides. And Ruth Custer, widowed only 2 springs prior, stood on her frost-hard field at dawn one October, sleeves rolled up, shoulders wrapped in a patched wool shawl, driving stakes into the ground in a circle that wasn't a circle. She was alone, no husband, no older sons, just her and the shape she kept tracing in the dirt, squinting at the angles like she was working out a riddle no one else could see. By noon, word had made it halfway down the valley. By supper, her nearest neighbors had gathered on the ridge trail above her land, watching from the safe distance of laughter. "What's she doing now?" asked Samuel Darnell, arms crossed against the wind. "Looks like she's marking another side." "Another?" he chuckled. "How many is that now? 7? 8, muttered old Harris Cobb, chewing bark off a stick. "Been watching since dawn. She's making it like a wheel." That drew hollers. "Wheelhouse, wagon home. Might as well live in a hog trough," someone jeered. "Maybe she's making a jail for her own thoughts." But Ruth didn't look up once. She hammered, paced, corrected, and redrew. Her breath came in silver clouds. She'd tied her graying hair up in a coil that barely held. Her dress was too thin, but she didn't seem to care. She worked like someone with a fire at her back and no time for laughter. Because Ruth remembered the last winter, and the one before. She remembered what it did to her husband. He'd been strong once, a man who could split a log with 2 swings, carry water for a whole settlement, build a cabin in 3 weeks flat. But that meant nothing in the ice. The old square house they'd built, north wall always freezing, the roof leaking where the snow pressed down like lead. The stove ate wood faster than she could chop it. Their youngest, Annie, had cried herself to sleep every night for a month because her toes stung so badly she thought they were dying. And then, in March, Ruth woke up next to silence. No cough, no stir, no complaint about his shoulder, just silence. She never said what happened, only that spring came too late for him. That was 2 winters ago. Now folks watched a widow drag timber into her field and hammer it into strange angles like she'd gone fevered. But Ruth had no fever. She had a notebook full of sketches, pages worn soft from rereading. She'd spent every night for the past year studying one thing: why the cold always won, not this time. She'd found something in a book written by a man she'd never met, printed in a town she'd never heard of. It talked about air, flow, angles, heat, rising and swirling in pockets instead of fleeing through corners. He'd built an 8-sided structure for cattle once, and said the air inside stayed warmer. She read the words a dozen times. Then she underlined one line and closed the book. The Octagon breathes. So Ruth decided her next cabin wouldn't just sit in the cold, it would fight it. No more flat walls for the wind to bully. No more corners where heat shriveled up and died. Her cabin would breathe, and the children would sleep warm. But that didn't stop the laughter. They laughed when she bought odd-shaped windows from a traveling peddler and fitted them like she was making a church. They laughed when she dug down into the hill instead of building up, said she was burying her own home. They laughed when she built the chimney dead center, not against the wall. They laughed when she hauled up piles of round river stones and packed them tight beneath the floorboards, one by one. "Making a nest for snakes," said Cobb, "or ghosts." They laughed the loudest when she chinked the seams with a mixture that was half clay, half, of all things, horse manure and straw. "Smells like she's walling herself in with a stable," someone howled. Ruth didn't answer, not once. Not when she scraped her hands raw hauling logs alone. Not when a storm flattened half the frame and she rebuilt it the next morning. Not when her eldest, Caleb, limped down the ridge from the sawmill with a splinter the size of a nail in his foot, and she had to boil it out by lantern light. And not even when the first snow came, early and cruel. That's when the wind changed, and not just in the weather. Because while other chimneys blew smoke sideways in the gale, Ruth's smoke rose straight, like her house was still and untouched. While the men were chopping twice the usual wood and complaining how it burned too fast, Ruth was stacking less and burning slower. While neighbor cabins grew frost on the inside of their windows, Ruth's glass stayed clear. And when the first deep freeze came and Old Man Cobb's porch cracked from the weight of frost, Ruth and her children sat inside on a rug made from stitched rags, eating bread warm enough to melt butter. People noticed. At first they didn't say anything, just grunted and nodded too long when she passed. But by midwinter, When the cold set in like a second skin, someone finally asked, "You using a new kind of stove?" Ruth didn't answer. She didn't even look up, just kept walking. The next week, they sent a boy to ask if he could borrow fire from her hearth to relight theirs. He said it was out, again, and their walls were cracking. Ruth handed him a jar of embers, still glowing, and closed the door. It was Samuel Darnell who came down in early January, a prideful man, hated to ask for anything. He showed up with a jug of cider and a half-rotted sack of carrots as offering. He didn't speak right away, just stood inside her entryway, hat in hand, eyes wandering around the inside of her home. Then he muttered low, "You ain't got a fire going?" Ruth pointed. The stove glowed faintly, no flame, just coal, slow and steady. "But it's near warm in here," he whispered, then blinked, turned to the walls. "How?" She didn't answer. He stared at the roundness, the low ceiling, the stones packed under the floor, the layered curtains on the inner walls, the strange pipe along the ceiling that moved smoke slower than usual. "You figured something out," he said finally. Still, Ruth didn't answer. He left, but the whispers stayed. "She ain't using a quarter of the wood we are. Caleb said they sleep in shirts, not coats. I seen the little one, Annie. She don't wear mittens indoors. She's using a trick, some trick." By the end of January, the laughter had stopped entirely, and by February, they started copying. One man added stone beneath his floor. Another sealed his walls with extra clay. Someone tried to angle their roof more steeply. Another moved his stove inward. But none of them built 8 walls. Only Ruth had done that. And when March brought the cruelest snap of all, when the sun fooled everyone with one warm day, then the cold returned like vengeance in the night. Every fire in the valley died out by morning, except one. Ruth's cabin, squat and strange, nestled into the earth like a burrowed animal, glowed soft in the snow. She didn't open the door that day, but someone knocked anyway. It wasn't Samuel this time. It was a mother. Her child's lips were blue. Ruth opened the door, let them in, then shut it quick to keep the heat. No one laughed after that, and still no one knew how warm it really was. Because what happened next, the storm, the near deaths, the desperate scramble for heat, was going to change the valley's view of Ruth Custer forever. She hadn't just outlasted the cold, she'd beaten it. And the shape, the 8 walls they'd all mocked, had been the reason why. The snowstorm didn't arrive like a storm should. It didn't scream across the sky or howl down from the mountains with a mouthful of fury. It crept, low, quiet, mean, like it wanted to fool folks into believing it wasn't there at all until it was too late to run. Ruth knew something was coming. She could feel it in the way the air dropped silent. The wind had gone still, the sky too pale. Snow didn't fall. It hung, and in the weeks leading up to it, animals had begun to disappear into the tree lines earlier and earlier each day. The squirrels, the hares, even the crows. She noticed it, noticed everything. Others didn't. They were still trying to fix what they'd mocked. One neighbor, Amos Kit, tried to wall his porch with hay bales. Another dug under his cabin and filled it with rocks like Ruth had, but used sharp-cut granite that didn't retain heat the way Riverstone did. They were copying by sight, not understanding the rhythm behind it, not listening the way Ruth had. When the cold broke again that early March night, it didn't shatter. It cracked slow. It groaned. The trees didn't whistle. They snapped, first one, then another, until the woods outside the valley sounded like a battlefield. And in the small, scattered homes dotting that valley, homes built square, flat, and proud, fires went out before midnight. The wind returned first. Not a wind you brace against, a wind you flinch from, a wind that finds the seams in your clothes and drills through them. It pressed against doors, slipped under floorboards, sucked warmth from skin and blood and breath. Inside Ruth's octagon, the heat held. Her children, Annie and Caleb, were already asleep beneath thick wool, curled together beside the low stove. Ruth didn't sleep. She sat near the door, lantern low, listening. She had made the outer wall thick, not just logs but layers. Log, chink, clay, straw, earth. A skirt of stone lined the base, and over that she had mounded packed dirt all winter, like a berm, like armor. She'd done it while others laughed, and now she ran her hand over that inner curve and felt it. Warmth, retained, rebounding. The octagon wasn't just warm, it held warmth. It didn't let the storm in, it breathed around it. At midnight, the first knock came. She didn't answer right away, just reached for her coat, stepped toward the door, and cracked it an inch. A gust slammed the gap like a fist. Outside was Tom Weller, eyes red, beard iced, cradling his boy, Jamie, in his arms. The child was limp. His breath barely showed. "Stove won't light," Tom said, voice shaking. "Everything's froze solid. I didn't know. It got bad too fast." Ruth stepped aside, said nothing. Tom stumbled in. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. He lowered Jamie beside the stove, and the boy's fingers began to twitch as the heat touched them. "I got Martha at the cabin," Tom whispered. "She's trying to boil snow to make something warm, but the pot cracked from the cold. She's got no gloves, Ruth, I don't think." "Bring her," Ruth said. I can't leave her with the door froze. It's warped. She's trying to burn the chairs. I came through the snow. It's knee-deep." Ruth pulled on her boots, lit a fresh lantern, and handed it to Caleb, who had woken without a word. Then she left, alone. She walked through wind that should have torn her eyes from her skull, past the ridgeline, across the flat toward the Weller place. Each step stole feeling from her legs, but she didn't stop, not once. By the time she reached Martha, the woman was sobbing with blood on her fingertips from trying to claw the stove door open. Ruth carried her out, arm under her ribs, and half dragged her back to the Octagon. When they arrived, others were already there. News had spread. 2 of the Harker boys sat near the far wall, rubbing frost off their faces. One of them held a kitten inside his coat. Another family, the Menlos, had bundled all 4 of their children in a single quilt and followed Tom's tracks down the slope when they saw his lantern return. By dawn, there were 9 people in the Octagon cabin, not counting Ruth and her 2. 10 souls warmed by one stove, and it didn't feel crowded. That was another thing no one had realized when they laughed at the shape. The space inside felt larger than it looked. No corners meant no wasted heat and no visual compression. Every wall curved inward slightly, cradling the warmth. It never escaped. She'd packed the floor with riverstone, yes, but beneath that, she'd buried a trench, a ring that looped under the floor and was filled with heat-holding ash and sand, like a primitive thermal battery. She hadn't read it from a book. She'd thought it up after noticing how her root cellar floor never froze, even when everything else did, and now it worked. The floor never froze. The Octagon breathed, but didn't shiver. More knocks came. Ruth stopped answering them with words. She just opened the door, and by midday, there were 22 people inside. Some sat near the walls sharing biscuits. Others slept against each other on the woven rugs. Children curled near the fire in pairs, still bundled but no longer trembling. Caleb kept feeding the stove 1 log every 2 hours, no more. The air stayed warm. The windows stayed clear. The roof never groaned. From the outside, you could see it. The miracle. No icicles, no frost on the eaves, just steam rising gently from the central pipe, like breath from a calm beast. The others tried to copy it in their panic. Across the valley, men stuffed rags into window seams. They tied quilts around door frames. They burned green wood and damp pine just to stay alive. But it wasn't enough. By nightfall, 2 cabins had collapsed, one under snowpack, the other when its stovepipe split from thermal shock and the fire inside cracked the roof beam. No deaths, but injuries, broken fingers, deep frostbite. A boy lost 3 toes. They limped toward the only place still glowing, Ruth's Octagon, and she let them in. By midnight of the second night, there were 36 people inside, and it was still warm, somehow. The heat, held in the bones of the place, kept rebounding. It wasn't just the stove, it was the shape, the stones, the double wall method she'd invented, the internal curtains that hung from the center to the walls, acting as thermal barriers, the air pipes she'd laid in autumn, allowing low draw and high recirculation. One man whispered, "It's like a womb." Someone else replied, "It's like God's hand." But Ruth didn't want praise. She wanted them to understand. She wanted them to remember, because come spring, they'd forget. They always did. Come sun and thaw and bird song, they'd go back to their square cabins and cut corners again, laugh again. So she made a choice. When the storm finally broke, 3 nights and 4 days later, and the valley emerged from its breathless silence like men waking from a dream, Ruth didn't ask for thanks, didn't ask for favors. She asked for wood, not for herself, for them. "Bring what you can spare," she said. "I'll show you how to use it right." So they did. Each man brought what little he had, a bundle, a cartful, a log. She piled it on the edge of her field. She let them see the stones she'd used. She let them look at the trench under her floorboards. She showed them how the chimney pipe curved to slow the draft, and how the air channels worked to trap heat. But she never drew a map. "If you want to build it," she said, "you've got to feel it." Only 3 of them tried that spring, but those 3 never froze again. And by next winter, half the valley had started building with rounded walls. Not full octagons, but attempts. The Castor Octagon, they started calling it. And Ruth, she kept the door open through the next storm too. She didn't care if they laughed again. She knew what the wind did to memory. But her house, it remembered for her. Spring didn't come so much as crawl. March limped toward April like a dog dragging a bad leg, spitting snow and thaw in equal measure, the creeks freezing one night and roaring the next. The valley didn't trust it, neither did Ruth. And the families who'd taken shelter in her cabin still walked around with a quietness they hadn't had before, like the storm had cracked something inside them that hadn't mended right. But it wasn't silence out of shame, it was something closer to reverence, because they'd seen it, they'd felt it, what it meant to be inside a place that was truly warm when the world outside had gone dead and white and mean, what it meant when the heat held. And that kind of memory sticks in the bones. The snow finally pulled back for good in early May, revealing damage across the whole valley. Roofs warped, logs split, fences toppled and half swallowed by the drifts. Some cabins were so waterlogged from hasty insulation tricks, tarps, moss, whatever could be stuffed in a seam, that entire floors had to be gutted. Fires had stained ceilings black. A few chimneys had cracked clean through. But Ruth's Octagon, bone dry, not a splinter out of place. When the neighbors came back that spring with their arms crossed and heads lowered, it wasn't with laughter, it was with questions. But they didn't ask them all at once. It trickled out of them like the melt from the ridges. A question here, a visit there. One man even wandered up to her fence with a loaf of hard bread and just stood there until she invited him in, too embarrassed to say what he really wanted. They wanted to know how it worked, why she of all people had figured it out, and Ruth told them when she had the time. She didn't act proud, she didn't gloat, but she didn't let them off easy either. She made them walk around the structure, let them see how it hugged the terrain, not against it, but with it. She pointed to the thickened southern wall, where sunlight struck longest. She made them sit inside while the stove was cold and feel how the air stayed still, unmoving, not a draft in sight. She showed them the stone-packed trench beneath the floorboards and the air returns that looped into the central hearth. The way the chimney pipe had a nested sleeve so warm smoke warmed incoming air before it entered the room. The layered curtains she used to trap heat in sections when needed. And most of all, she talked about the shape, not in numbers or terms, not octagon or angles. She called it the hold. The cold can't grip it, she told one man, running her hand along the rounded seam between two walls. It don't give the wind a place to bite. Some of the men scoffed at that, out of habit more than belief. But then they'd look up at the roofline, and they'd go quiet again. Still, not everyone believed. A few neighbors rebuilt their homes the same way they had before, square, four-walled, single-pitch roof. But you could tell they hesitated now, watched the wind more, felt the frost in the floorboards deeper. By midsummer, 3 new homes had been framed using Ruth's design. Not exact copies, nobody had the patience or stubborn will to replicate it precisely, but near enough. Rounded corners, central chimneys, stones underfoot. And in town, the talk had spread further. Word got to a man named Emery Trask, a trader who dealt in stoves, pots, pipe, and mail-order housing guides. He'd heard from a cousin who'd nearly lost his daughter during the freeze, and how they'd sheltered in a widow's 8-wall cabin that didn't burn a full cord all winter. He'd laughed at first, then frowned, then rode out with a bundle of catalogues tucked under his coat and a measuring stick strapped to his saddlebag. He found Ruth in her garden, sleeves up, elbows deep in soil. "Mom," he said, doffing his hat, "I heard a thing or two about your place here, and I'd be real honored if I could take a look around, maybe even sketch it proper. Folks might pay for a build like this, especially the further north you go." She looked up, sun in her eyes, dirt on her palms. "You'll pay for my time?" she asked. He blinked. "Well, I figured I might offer—" "No," she said, "not what I meant." Then she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "You can look, but you'll tell it right." He smiled, thinking she meant the story of her beating the cold. But Ruth had something else in mind, because by that point she'd begun to understand the real shape of what she'd built. It wasn't just about warmth. It was about how warmth moved, and how people moved around warmth. Inside a square cabin, everything faces corners. Beds, chairs, tables, all jammed into angles. The stove goes at one end, the cold seeps through the others. Everyone fights for the center. But in Ruth's Octagon, the heat was the center, and every room breathed toward it. Not just heat, people. There was no side of the room that felt far. No corner that cut off the little ones from the adults. You could sit in any part of the space and feel part of the whole. It wasn't just efficient, it was human. And that's what Ruth told Trask as he scribbled in his book and tapped along her walls. He asked about insulation. She talked about sorrow. He asked about airflow. She spoke about silence. He didn't get it, not really, but he nodded enough to pretend. And when he left, He offered her $12 for the rights to reproduce her design in his mail order pamphlets. She told him no, not unless she wrote it herself. She'd seen too many ideas get warped by hands that didn't understand the why. They'd build it wrong, leave out the trench, skimp on the air pipe, forget the layered chink mix, and then when it failed, they'd say her design was to blame. So Ruth wrote it herself, a guide, 24 pages, bound with thread, copied by hand at first. Later, a traveling teacher helped her set it in type at the county print shop. She titled it The Hold, A Hearth-Scented Cabin for Cold Country by Ruth M. Castor. The title made men scoff, too poetic, too soft, but the ones who read it, really read it, never built square again. By the next winter, a preacher in the valley had adopted the design. A storekeeper in town had reshaped his pantry with the thermal trench beneath. A midwife used Ruth's layered curtain technique to divide her birthing room from the outer chamber where she slept. And when the first snow came, none of them burned more than half a cord of wood through the first full freeze. Then came the hardest test yet. That winter, in late January, a sickness moved through the valley. Not fast, not loud, a slow kind of cold that started in the chest and crawled down the ribs until folks couldn't breathe. A lung rot, the doctor said, came on after wet air and froze lungs too slow to dry. It hit square cabins first, took Old Man Cobb's wife, then one of the Harker twins. People tried to fight it with poultices and boiled pine needles, but most of the valley had already spent their wood. They'd burned too hot, too fast in their drafty homes, and now they were left cold and sick. They came again to Ruth, but not just to stay. They came to ask. They brought her food, tools, seeds. They asked for her help, but offered hands in return. And Ruth, she didn't turn them away. She opened the cabin again, but this time, she did something more. She sent Annie and Caleb to teach. Every evening, her children walked to a different home and showed them how to line a wall with packed earth, how to make the manure clay mix that sealed like stone, how to angle a stovepipe to draw heat instead of siphon it away. She called it the cold school. Some kids laughed at the name, but by February, they were all attending, and one by one, the cabins began to change. Not overnight, not fully, but enough to hold, enough to survive. And as the years passed, the shape caught on, not because it was fancy, not because it was new, but because the cold kept coming back, and nothing else stopped it like 8 walls, a buried trench, and a widow's stubborn heart. The valley changed slow, not all at once, not loud and proud the way progress sometimes does, but quiet, like frost melting back into soil, like roots shifting deeper, while the surface still looks still. By the third winter after the storm, nearly half the cabins in the region had some part of Ruth Castor's design. Maybe it was only the chimney now placed in the center. Maybe it was the insulated trench beneath the floorboards, filled with ash and rock. Maybe it was rounded corners on just 2 walls. Maybe it was layered curtains inside, drawn with method, not for privacy but retention, to trap heat in the places where breath turned visible. But the heart of it, the idea, had taken root. No one laughed at 8 sides anymore. The term Octagon cabin didn't get strange looks in town. In fact, it became a selling point. A few years later, a family from 2 valleys over bought land nearby and built an almost identical shape to Ruth's using the printed booklet she'd authored. Their cousin, a wheelwright from Vermont, came to visit and brought the idea back with him. That spring, 3 letters arrived from settlements Ruth had never heard of, places where the cold swept down so hard that men had to sleep with their boots on. Each letter asked her the same thing. Would you send a drawing? Would you send a copy of the stove layout? Would you explain how you buried the trench without it sinking come thaw? And Ruth, who'd once been mocked for doing something off, now found herself writing instructions by candlelight, folding pages into envelopes by hand, and tying them with twine for the weekly post rider to collect. She never asked for money, only asked one thing in return. Tell me how it holds. Tell me how your people slept. She kept every reply, wrapped them in oilskin and tucked them into a drawer near the hearth. Over the years, that drawer filled so much it stuck when she opened it. Letters from widows, homesteaders, fathers, school teachers, even a nurse who built her clinic's waiting room in a half-octagon shape just because she believed the cold couldn't find the corners. Ruth smiled at that one, but she didn't rest. Because while others had learned how her cabin worked, few still understood why. Not just warmth, safety, not just a clever design, a place where breath could stay soft and children's hands could stay pink. So she kept teaching, quietly, patiently. And one cold October morning, 4 winters after the long storm, she stood on the ridge above the valley, shawl wrapped over her shoulders, watching something she never thought she'd see. It wasn't a barn raising, it was a circle raising. 8 walls, cedar logs, a whole town gathered to help one family, newcomers from out east, build their cabin using the full caster plan. No cut corners, no shortcuts. A real octagon. She watched the way they measured the slope of the sun, the way the central chimney hole was dug first, not last, the way the foundation ring was lined with stone and dry-packed ash, exactly as she'd written in her book, and she said nothing, only smiled, pulled her shawl tight, and walked back down the ridge. It would have been easy to stop the story there. Neat and tied, valley saved, cold beaten, laughter turned to respect. But the truth doesn't always end that way, because there are always new winters, always new storms, and not everyone learns. That same year, a trader named Levis Hoare came through, slick hair, clean boots, rolled map cases under one arm. He'd heard of Ruth Castor, heard of the design, and smelled a chance to sell it big. "You've got something brilliant here," he told her, leaning over her garden fence like it was his idea. "But you're wasting it on pamphlets and neighbors. Let me print it wide. I've got connections in St. Louis, even Chicago. There are places where folks freeze in houses 5 times the size of yours because they build with pride, not brains." He smiled when he said it, expecting her to laugh too. She didn't. "You want my plans?" she said. "I want to share them," he corrected. "For a fee, of course, for both of us." "What fee?" "Let's say 70-30, your favor, of course." She looked past him, at the trees, the ridges. "No, ma'am, you could help hundreds, thousands. You could be known." "I'm already known," she said, not bragging, just stating. He stayed 3 days, trying to charm her children, showing them printed books with glossy sketches of homes built like towers, homes with arches and glass, and imported tile. "You want to beat the cold," he said. "You make it fear you." But Ruth already knew how to beat the cold. You didn't yell at it. You outsmarted it, and no one could sell that. So when he left, grumbling about missed chances, and a woman wasting her own fortune, she folded the letter he left her and used the back of it to write a recipe for onion broth. Never mentioned him again, and in the way, the cabin never creaked, not even once. The neighbors who mocked her, some moved, some stayed, some copied every inch of her design, some didn't. But when the next long freeze hit, a 5-day cold snap that dropped to numbers even the mountain men hadn't seen, every single one of them sent a child or a wife or a cousin to knock on her door, not to beg, to ask, to learn. And Ruth opened that door every time, no matter who it was, even Samuel Darnell, especially him. He came one day with his hat in hand, face grayer now, voice lower. "You were right," was all he said. She didn't answer, just handed him a cup of cider and told him to sit near the hearth, because some things don't need to be said, not when you've got 8 sides to hold them. The year Ruth Castor died, the valley stayed warm, not from mild weather. That winter was harder than most. A cold front pushed down through the pass and froze the water lines by October. The deer left early. The snow came late and heavy. The air thinned until people swore they could hear their own skin tighten when they stepped outside. One man lost the tips of his ears before Christmas. Another buried 3 goats frozen where they stood, nostrils crusted with ice. But the cabins stayed warm because they weren't square anymore. Not all of them were perfect octagons, but nearly every home now bore the touch of Ruth's stubborn design. Circular hearths, buried stone, central heat, earth-thick walls that curved around warmth like arms around a child. People no longer chopped 3 cords in panic. They chopped 1, maybe 2, and rationed it calm. That winter, there were no deaths from cold, not one. The valley didn't realize what that meant until it was almost spring, when someone asked aloud, "When was the last time we didn't bury someone in the frost?" And no one had an answer. That's when the letters began arriving again, this time from farther out. Missouri, Iowa, Colorado. One from Montana scrawled on birch bark with a note that read, "Saw one of your cabins out this way. Built it for my girl. Thought you should know she slept through the freeze just fine. We owe you, stranger." They'd come to Ruth because the people who learned from her had carried the warmth outward, and now the warmth carried her name. The Castor Hold, that's what they were calling it, not just the Octagon cabin anymore. That name faded. The Hold was what stuck, because that's what it did. It held heat, air, family, hope, and when Ruth passed, it was not with sickness, not with suffering, not even with warning. She rose one morning, walked the cabin perimeter, her usual habit, tending to the small draft panels and pipe catches. Then she sat near the stove, rested her hand on the top stone, and closed her eyes. She didn't open them again. Annie found her still warm, face calm, back straight. Caleb said she looked more like part of the room than a person inside it, like she'd slipped into the bones of the cabin and become the warmth itself. They buried her in the garden behind the cabin, under the trees that leaned east. She had once told her children that the wind came harder from the west, and so the grave should face east toward the sunrise. They didn't argue. That spring, when the first wildflowers bloomed, her children added a small marker of polished stone near the porch. She built something that held. They didn't need to explain more. Everyone in the valley knew what it meant. The cold school continued. In fact, it grew. A neighbor offered a plot of land beside the river to build a permanent structure for it, a teaching hall made in Ruth's full style, with true 8 walls, a central hearth, radiant stone floors, and thermal curtains that rotated by season. They called it the Ruth Room. Children from the valley and beyond walked there each week, learning not only how to build, but why. They weren't taught numbers first. They were taught need. Why does a child sleep better when the corners are gone? Why does heat stay when it has nowhere to run? Why does silence help a fire grow steadier than wind? They studied warmth the way some people studied stars, and they passed the lessons on. One boy, Toby Harker, grew up and became a builder, not just of homes, but of community centers, churches, meeting halls. He traveled south to Kansas and even Oklahoma, helping families rebuild after drought and displacement. In his satchel, he carried a folded drawing, edges frayed from years of use, Ruth's original floor plan, hand-sketched in charcoal and sealed in wax paper. He never charged for that part of his work. When people asked why, he said, "Because a woman let me sleep near her fire when mine had gone out, and I woke up with fingers still pink." Another girl, Sarah Darnell, Samuel's granddaughter, became a writer. She published a book titled The Shape That Held the Cold, part memoir, part history. It was read in schoolhouses for years afterward. In the foreword, she wrote, "We used to think strength meant pushing against the cold, but Ruth Castor taught us strength is what lets warmth stay. She gave us 8 walls and a way to survive, and in doing so, taught us to build homes not out of pride but care." Even outsiders came to see the original cabin. Some came expecting something grand, a monument. They left quiet, humbled. The building was still simple, still low to the ground, the walls thick, the windows small. But inside it felt like memory, like warmth made solid. Every footstep softened, every breath came easy. And the stove, still original, still central, still slow burning with the trench of stone and ash beneath. A man from a university once visited with a notepad full of questions and a long list of thermodynamic calculations. He left with one sentence circled: "You don't fight the cold, you hold the warm." That's what made the Castor hold different. It wasn't a weapon, it was a refuge. It didn't blaze, it lasted. And now every time a storm moved through the hills, every time the wind rose up the ridge and howled down across the trees, someone, somewhere, in some valley cabin would pause, feel the way the warmth held steady against the door, and remember the widow they once laughed at. They'd think of the way she worked with dirt under her nails, stacking stone by hand, dragging logs across her field alone. They'd remember how she opened the door when others shut theirs, and they'd say in that quiet, reverent way, "She built a place that never let the cold win." And then they'd turn back to their stoves, feed one more log, and let the heat breathe.